Hello and a very warm welcome to the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. Well, it's been 1 week since the election, time for those parties, particularly those who lost and lost big, to reflect. That means a lot of debates within the Conservatives and the SNP. Today, we are concentrating on the fallout within the SNP, and I'm delighted to say that we have Stewart McDonald with us today to chew over some of the issues which have been exercising people within the party since last week. For 9 years, he was the member for Glasgow South, frontbench spokesman for the party, columnist, someone with very clear views on where the party should be headed. First of all, Stewart, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Bernard. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. Now, just before we get into the sort of nitty-gritty of why the party lost, and perhaps more importantly, what it should do now, from your point of view as a candidate, at what point, either in the campaign or the night, were you aware that you were about to be an ex-MP?
Well, I knew it was a probable outcome pre-election. I'd known for some time, largely because I can read an opinion poll. But, I had a sense that we were drifting, and that drift was going to come at my expense and the expense of other colleagues, good colleagues in places like Glasgow. Now, there was always a question mark over my own seat if, could we be the one of two seats maybe in Glasgow that we could save? But as the campaign went on, it became obvious that was not going to happen. And on the night itself, for your listeners who haven't been to election counts, when we started the sampling, we knew within 10 minutes that we were not just behind, but substantially, and that was happening right across the city. So in a sense, I was in a headspace that said, I want to win. I wouldn't be standing if I didn't want to win. And I'm going to fight it to win it. But I'm governed by reality and know what an uphill struggle that will be. But that, I think, psychologically allowed me to be prepared for the outcome, which I think was a blessing, because I know that some colleagues who definitely didn't expect to lose have found it much, much tougher to deal with. And I feel for them in that regard. But for myself and for my staff team and my campaign team, we kind of knew that the writing was on the wall some time back.
Because it's a very brutal process, isn't it? And good morning, Stuart, and thanks for joining us. People lose their jobs in lots of different walks of life all the time, obviously, but they don't lose their jobs in a public setting like this. And so, you're at the count. You've got to put a brave face on it, unless you're George Galloway or Liz Truss, and so on. In the former circumstances, you just don't turn up. In the latter, you're very sort of curt and abrupt, and so on, and you blame the voters basically. But you're expected to, give a speech where you've got to thank the police. You've got to say, what a jolly good fellow your successor happens to be, and wish them luck. It's a very public and brutal way in which a sort of referendum is cast on you. And that, how do you juggle this sort of thing between, this is a verdict on the party without taking it personally, and how much do you find it sort of thinking of it as a kind of personal repudiation after 9 years of serving the good people of Glasgow South?
Well, look, you always look back and wonder what you could have done differently, both in the course of the campaign, but also the 9 years I was the elected MP, and I'll have plenty more time to think about that for sure. I guess there's a saving grace in Glasgow. Only the winner gives a speech, although it's a somewhat abrupt ending to 9 years of public service. And you know what? I didn't just have a brave face on it. I kept myself smiling because I'm happy for my successor. My successor is a new kid on the block. He's a decent, smart, intelligent young guy, elected around about the same age I was elected in 2015. I had a good conversation with him where I told him he was the winner, and he was sort of saying, perhaps out of politeness, "Oh, I don't know, Stuart, you might still do it." I got the chance to meet his partner and his parents, and I know many of his activists because I know the local Cathcart Labour team. They're all good people. We had a good campaign. And I'm always struck by the way Tom Harris, who is my predecessor, how he behaved in 2015, where Labour MPs at that point were told by their headquarters, do not go to the count until right before the declaration, which in Glasgow is about 4:30 in the morning. And Tom took the view that, well, hang on, we've got a whole bunch of Labour volunteers surrounded by jubilant gnats, and I'm not going to just leave them there. And I think it was important for me and for other SNP MPs who were losing out to be down there with those who fought alongside us. Yes, surrounded by jubilant Labour folk, but certainly nothing poisonous or difficult. And you just got to get on with it. I mean, this is the nature of the beast. We enjoyed it when the times were good. And as my successor said to me, he said, Stewart, this will happen to me one day as well. And that's the nature of politics.
They learn so young.
I don't have any regrets about how it happened. I mean, I wanted it to be over with because I was absolutely knackered. But in terms of the way in which it's done in the atmosphere, I have to say I was pretty lucky.
Do you think there was anything
You've got 9
you
years
could have done?
I think we fought a good ground campaign here in Glasgow South. I mean, I need to sit and properly go through samples, ballot box samples from different parts of the constituency and all the rest of it. But my campaign team is small, but they are good. They work hard. They're effective. But on that swing, I don't think I was ever going to be able to. I was able to buck that trend. There are things I would like to have done differently, perhaps, but do I think it would have made a difference to the outcome? I'm doubtful, I have to say.
I suppose electors don't really, because they're not up close and personal with politicians. They don't see the long hours. They don't see the fact that on a Saturday you're also working with constituency surgeries. They don't see the antisocial side to the job, sitting in airport lounges, late night sittings in the House of Commons, all of that kind of stuff. If we can use a Glasgow expression, you knock your pan in for 9 years. You've genuinely done your best to help everyone in your constituency, irrespective of whether they voted for you or not, because that is the nature of the job. And then all of a sudden, you're turfed out. Were people within the party, have they been sort of fulsome in their praise of you? Have they been grateful for the work that you've done? Have you had messages of support from opponents? Because you've just, in a sense, been incredibly magnanimous to the new member of Parliament who's effectively taken your job.
I've had lots of nice, kind messages from constituents, from opponents, from people who I've helped, people who I've worked alongside in various guises over the 9 and a bit years. I've had a couple of messages from opponents that have surprised me, that perhaps I didn't expect to get. I've had lots of nice messages from my local party. That's the one thing that does feel nice, when you get all this nice, fulsome praise and all the rest of it. And if all of the people who said they voted for me did vote for me, I'm sure I wouldn't be an ex-MP. I think I'd still be the current MP. But again, it's the nature of the beast. And at the end of the day, you've just got to get on with it. I have no malice whatsoever towards my successor. I wish him well. I hope he does well for the constituency, and I hope he has a good career and succeeds in whatever it is he wants to do. And, I'd be on hand to share any of the tricks that I've picked up over the past 9 years.
You say you'd hope he'd have a nice career and so on, but presumably you'd also like him to have a short one.
Yeah, I would like him to have a short one. Am I out to personally try and make it shorter? No. But, ultimately, he is the MP for Glasgow South. He has at least one parliamentary term to serve. And I hope that not only is he good at it, but I hope he enjoys it. It's tougher now than when it was even when I was first elected in 2015. It is physically demanding, mentally demanding, at times emotionally draining. And that's the same for all MPs, no matter what colour of rosette they wear during the campaign. So I genuinely do wish him well, and I hope he enjoys it. I hope he looks after himself.
I mean, if we're looking at, the SNP, obviously, this was a wave election in Scotland, as it turned out, in the same way, in certain respects, as 2015 was, when, of course, the SNP won 56 out of the then 59 Scottish constituencies. This time, a huge defeat, a huge setback for the SNP, and there is no point trying to deny or sugarcoat that. It seems to me. Now it's difficult to, election results have many different causes, don't they? There are lots of strands that make up the rope of an election result. But if you look at this one, what do you think were the sort of 2 or 3 factors that most satisfactorily or afford the sort of greatest amount of explanation for the scale of the setback that the SNP suffered last week?
Well, look, my thoughts on this are still fairly sketchy, but I have a few you'll be glad to know. Firstly, I don't think the defeat can be laid at any one person's feet. I don't think it can be blamed on any single policy or any single event, but rather there are a series of things that have caused this. But fundamentally, I agree with the analysis by Mark McGagan, one of the pollsters here in Scotland and an academic, that says this was an election not just about change, but about competence and delivery. And on competence and delivery, our reputation has taken a battering over the past few years. And the sense I picked up when I was going door to door, even with people who are normally happy to vote SNP and consider themselves to be SNP voters, we've strayed, and they feel that we've stopped listening to them, and so they've stopped listening to us. And that is something that we need to address. And I don't think the way to address that is by blaming it all on one person, one policy, one event. As I've said, I think we have a cultural problem within the SNP, and that cultural problem is about seriousness. Yeah, I've got a few examples I can give, but one that sticks in my mind, for example, is the de facto referendum policy, which was announced really without any consultation or any proper discussion, although the party was set to have a debate on it. But I said at the time, I published a whole document on why I thought a de facto referendum was a bad idea. I thought it was a bad policy for the government, a bad policy for the party, for the cause of independence, and for the country more broadly, not least those who don't support independence. And I outlined all of that in over 4,000 words. And I received a number of messages from folk telling me they privately agreed with me. And that was also that was happening alongside a whole series of tweets and messages and all the rest of it telling me I wasn't a true believer, or I was an MI5 plant and all this sort of rubbish. But I was getting messages from MPs, MSPs, Scottish government ministers at the time telling me they also thought the policy was a bad idea, but neither internally or externally were willing to say so because they didn't want to be seen as being responsible for a fight or a split or a rammy or whatever it might be. And so a political culture that operates like that is not a serious political culture. And that is one of the things that we need to change. And look, there are other examples of how that unseriousness has manifested itself. We've had debates about whether or not economic growth is a good thing. This just looks weird to people. And guess what? It turns out the voters were noticing the entire time. And so I don't want to lay this at the feet of a person or a policy. There's plenty blame to go around, my goodness. And look, I have to own some of this as well, right? I've been a player in this machine for 9 years now. But I think the reckoning we need fundamentally at its core is about, are we a serious political party or not? Are we a pressure group? Are we an NGO? Or are we a party that aspires to govern and aspires to statehood for Scotland? And you cannot be everything to all people if you're serious about the aspiration of statehood and government.
Let me sort of make one or two observations on what you've said, Stewart. And the observations are as much to play devil's advocate with the points that you're making. You say that you don't want to to lay the blame at the door of any one person. And in a sense, I suppose I can understand that, because political parties are collectives. And in this sense, there's not one parliamentary group that affects the outcome, but two, one at Westminster, one at Holyrood.
Yeah.
I would merely make the observation that there did not appear to me, as an outsider, a journalist looking in, that particularly in the aftermath of the Brexit result, that there was any serious thinking going on about where the party was going to take the Scottish constitutional question. On the morning after the Brexit result, Nicola Sturgeon announced at Bute House, well, I've instructed the civil servants to start work on a bill for a second referendum. Then the can seemed to be kicked down a very, very long road. Then we had COVID. And then when the then First Minister, appeared to run out of road and was finding interviews increasingly more difficult on the question, what is your strategy? Hey, presto, we get the de facto referendum, which probably came as a surprise to some people within the party. Now, you ask the question, is it serious politics? Is it growing up politics? I'm going to suggest to you that that kind of leadership over a question like that was not growing up. And that entirely can be laid at the door of the First Minister, because she kept, as you well know, all of these things fairly tight in terms of her own kitchen cabinet, and the sort of wider movement where we're simply waiting for the tablets of stone to be handed down. So I'm putting to you the issue that, she must carry the blame, because she sets the culture within the party. And if there is a lack of debate and a lack of collegiate thinking, who else is there to blame bar the leader?
So obviously the leader has to take a large portion of the blame. I'm not here to defend that at all. But the cultural problems, believe me, go far greater than that. The conspiracy of silence over issues to avoid a perceived rammy or a perceived split or whatever goes well beyond one person. But you're right, the culture is set from the top. And what we saw, as you mentioned, following the Brexit vote in 2016, was a lot of short-term thinking, a lot of short-term tactics, some of which were successful in the short term, but a long-term strategy there was not. And there were various people within the parliamentary party at Westminster and elsewhere who were trying to work on a kind of long-term strategy post the Brexit result, and trying to breach the walls of that small kitchen cabinet, as you say, Bernard. But unfortunately, they were to be unsuccessful. And by the way, some of those strategies that people had, I might not necessarily have agreed with, but at least they were trying to force a debate internally. But that wasn't easy or possible in many ways.
I mean, you mentioned there that, the SNP was having an internal debate about whether economic growth is a good thing, which to most external observers seems preposterous. And yet, you had a coalition government at Holyrood between a party, the SNP, which ostensibly believes in economic growth, accepts its necessity, its importance, indeed campaigns for independence on the grounds that we will be better off, we will be a wealthier people, a wealthier country after independence. And you're in coalition with the party, the Scottish Green Party, that explicitly opposes economic growth, think that this is an outdated concept, and actually supports independence on the grounds that we will all be poorer and somehow more virtuous and better off as a result. These two things cannot sit comfortably side by side. Do you think that the coalition, albeit it had ended by the time of this election, had a significant impact on support for SNP candidates up and down the country? Do you think that the Green do you think that the Green influence on the Scottish government and its approach, its agenda on a whole range of issues, hurt nationalists while actually boosting the Green Party's fortunes?
Perhaps it did, and again, would need to look more at the data and the evidence on this. But if I think of Glasgow, and if I think in particular of my own constituency, the Green vote went from under 3% to 10%. in this election. And as I used to have to say to colleagues down south, the Greens are an actual thing here. They have their own voters, their own electorate. Too often we thought of them as SNP votes on loan. But, whether that was the extent to which that coalition damaged or hurt us or led to last Thursday's result, I would probably need more time to think about. And much of the damage that was done to our credibility, our reputation for good government happened during that time. And then, of course, it was all spectacularly undone in the most bizarre public fashion and led to the loss of the SNP leader. So, there's not much of those coalition years that I will remember fondly, even if I can entirely understand why seeking such a coalition was perhaps a desirable thing to do at the time.
Getting back to this culture within the party in terms of debate or the lack of debate, I'm old enough to remember when the SNP conference is crackled with debate, and there were people who approached the home rule question from a completely and utterly different strategic point of view. But they had the debates, the party agreed a position, the leadership took it forward, and those who had, if you like, lost the debate, nevertheless accepted that they were part of the same movement, and that after having a grown-up debate, they all get behind the leadership. Now, the former First Minister was a parliamentary neighbour of yours, so you would have seen a lot of her. You've made the point that you wrote these 4,000 words pointing out what you thought the pitfalls were of a de facto referendum. I mean, I'm assuming that you said to her, Nicola, I don't think this is a good idea for the following reasons. What did she say to you?
So I spoke to Nicola in the December that she announced, after she announced the de facto referendum. And if I remember the dates correctly, Bernard, we were set to have this special conference in the March. And I said to her then, I said, look, I don't think this is a good idea. Here are the reasons why. And, she kind of said to me why she thought she had to advocate it, why she was in the position she was in to advocate it. And when I was getting closer to publishing my reasons, and I told the then First Minister I was going to publish a paper on this, I spoke to several people, senior people within the government, about it, many of whom were agreeing with me, but we're just really, really desperate to avoid a fight. We're really, really desperate to avoid a split or a rammy, despite the fact we were being told that this had to be a genuine and open debate. And all of those people who were telling me privately, MSPs, ministers, MPs, activists and others, that even if they didn't think all of my arguments were right, they certainly didn't think the de facto referendum policy was the right one to follow. Few of them were willing to put their head above the parapet for fear of being seen as a troublemaker, or perhaps they just didn't want the grief that can often go with going against the grain. That's the kind of culture that we really need to put behind us. And at the risk of rambling on for too long, Bernard, and please do shut me up if I am, I'll give you another example. I recall a few years ago, we passed a conference motion, or there was a motion brought forward on the removal of nuclear weapons post-independence. Now, our policy had always been that the weapons will go as swiftly and as safely as possible. There was nothing wrong with that policy. It stood us in good stead for many, many years. But a resolution was brought forward that we would put a timetable on that of 2 years. And I was the defence spokesman at the time. And I said, I spoke to senior people within government, special advisors, ministers, senior people in the parliamentary group at Westminster, to say, I don't think this is a good policy to pursue. One, I don't think 2 years is possible. And secondly, just from a purely political viewpoint, I don't see why we have to put a timescale on this. And also, the timescale cannot just be set in stone by us as one party. And put in writing all the various reasons why I thought this was a policy that we just didn't need to pass. I didn't think it made any political sense to pass it. Even if 2 years was desirable, I didn't think it was possible. But I was told to just let it pass and be a good soldier, essentially, and effectively ignore the policy. And when I sort of protested and said, well, hang on, I'm the defence spokesman, I'm the guy who ultimately has to sell this, and I was effectively just told, look, we need to avoid a Rami on this at conference. You've got a point. We know you know what you're talking about because you've worked on this, but just let it pass. I mean, this is the kind of culture I'm talking about. This is what needs to go. This is what needs to be a part of our history. And if we're to be successful, if we're to not get horsed in 2026 and enjoy a long spell in opposition, this kind of culture cannot last.
Do you think getting horsed, as you put it, in 2026 is now the most likely outcome of the Holyrood election?
Yes.
Okay. Would you perhaps like to expand on that?
Well, look, let me try and say something positive. I don't believe we need a change of leader. I think John Swinney is obviously not that long in post, but what we need to see is a leader who gets it, who understands the difficult position we're in, and more importantly, has the type of reform agenda for the party and for the government, for the country, that can bring us back to a position where voters are listening to us again, get us back to a position where we are seen as the natural vehicle for aspirational voters in Scotland. Develop a culture within the party where we can have serious grown-up debates and disagreements and then rally around a position. If we don't do these things, then why would voters not horse us even more than they just did a week ago? I'm looking at, for example, a Labour government that's been a week in office, and it's very much getting on with its agenda. It's very much being seen to be active and on the front foot. I'm looking at the motions we're about to debate at our upcoming party conference, one of which includes a debate on the national anthem for an independent Scotland. I mean, get real. This is just
okay,
not serious.
But what do you think the anthem should be?
I couldn't give a monkeys.
Stuart, let me come back to this issue of leadership. And again, just for the purposes of playing devil's advocate, let me put a point to you that actually, although and I understand why you don't want to personalize it, the issues of leadership actually count. And let me put to you that Nicola Sturgeon's strategy on the national question was simply incoherent. There wasn't one, then there was one at the 11th hour, and then folk didn't seem to understand it. And in any case, when it was played, the polls were showing that it wasn't necessarily the number one issue of voter concern. Her successor as First Minister can't fire a health minister when I think it was pretty obvious that the health minister had to be fired. And this was a First Minister who shot himself in the head by ending a coalition rather than allowing the Greens to end the coalition for him. And now we have another First Minister who goes into an election saying line 1, page 1 of the manifesto should be about independence, is about independence. It's in our DNA, despite the fact, again, the polls are suggesting that whilst, again, nearly 50%, if not 50% of the population believe in independence, it's not what they necessarily want to talk about now. I simply make the point that the cumulative effect of leaders who take bad decisions, either on strategy or, in Humza Yousaf's case, the day-to-day management of issues, which he makes worse by his own incompetence, the cumulative effect of that is not good for your party. And again, I put the point rhetorically to you. Did John Swinney have all that good a campaign when, yes, independence is in our DNA, and then move on to other issues? That appears to me to be not competent leadership. And I would put to you that people within the party who are saying we need a new generation. We need somebody with fresh ideas, not somebody who has been part of this collective for so long. I get where they're coming from and saying we need to skip a generation and we need people with fresh ideas.
So we definitely need fresh ideas. I mean, the important question here, excuse me, the important question here is, if we're all agreed on the need for change, what's the change, and who can most credibly deliver that change? I said at the last leadership contest that the line Kate Forbes used, "continuity won't cut it," was spot on. What the SNP needed to do, and still needs to do, is we all need to think about the hardwiring, change and upgrade and modernisation of the party, its political culture, its political philosophy, its long-term strategy for the country, its long-term strategy for independence, and have a fulsome debate in which nothing is off the table, in which there are no sacred cows. Because what you've just outlined is us kind of floating from leader to leader to leader, often being buffeted by events, often making poor decisions and bad judgment calls. I do trust John Swinney to try and turn things around. I think he could do it. I think he wants to do it. I had a brief conversation with him on the phone last week, but it will require him, if I can use some fruity language, to be a ruthless bastard. And I told him, if you get the calls right and you have the right kind of agenda, and you need to be a bit of a bastard, people like me will have your back. All of that being said, very clearly there are, ambitious people in the party who are not necessarily looking to oust others, but they're good thinkers with good ideas and who've got interesting things to say. These people need to be heard, and they need to be encouraged to speak up and put their ideas forward, not just on the internal wirings of the party, but on the policy agenda that's going to deliver competency and good government, so that we can get back into a position where people see us as a party that can be trusted to run our national affairs in the devolved setting, but also trusted to take the country forward when the time is right on the independence question. That ain't happening anytime soon if we don't have the kind of wholesale change and upgrade and personality change that the party needs.
Yeah. But on that question and so on, I mean, I think you've suggested that, the party needs to have what you called a hard pause on the independence question. And we've had sort of 8 years where every 6 months the date for a new referendum has been announced, or independence is back on. The front pages of the National are a splendid catalogue of the way in which successive party leaders have marched the movement, marched the troops up to the top of the hill, and then marched them back down again. My favourite front page of these was Belgian ports told to prepare for independence. And I remember thinking, well, that is the sort of thing that is certainly going to convince a lot of no voters that the time is ripe for reopening the national question and for answering yes to that question. But I don't see. I mean, it comes back to the seriousness question that you were talking about. I don't see how you can spend the best part of a decade marching the troops around like this and remain a serious party. I mean, you've spent a lot of time, it seems to be, in managing the Yes movement, managing SNP members and SNP supporters, and very little time, I would say to you, talking to people who are not already within the tent. And the more you talk about independence, the more people think, hang on a minute, we've just been through a decade of constitutional warfare, both in terms of the Scottish question and then subsequently with Brexit. And one accepts that Brexit simplifies the political argument for independence while complicating a lot of the practical arrangements that would ensue from independence. And yet the SNP doesn't do any work on that. All the questions that people who voted no in 2014 remain open and unanswered, actually. And if I was an SNP supporter, I think I would be astonished and appalled and angry, actually, that the party fundamentally hasn't done the work to address the reasons why people voted no in 2014 and hasn't appreciated that times change and the public mood changes. And so I suppose the question is, why hasn't the SNP done that work? Is it just because the SNP believes in the inevitability of independence and wrong-thinking people will eventually come to the correct conclusions? Or is there something else? Is there just a sort of a disinclination to engage with opposing viewpoints?
Yeah, I don't disagree with much of that. Let me just say at the outset, though, to your question, Alex, it's not that I have said we need a hard pause. The hard pause has been delivered for us, whether we like that or not. That was done last Thursday and was evident in ballot boxes up and down the country. So the hard pause is here, and we need to think about what we do with that time. And that requires us to, stop thinking in the short term, start thinking in the long term, be prepared to have those conversations with the bit of the electorate who are not overly hostile on the independence question. They've got things to say on it, and they'll support it if the right offer is made. But I strip all this right back to the governance right now. If we don't have a reputation for good governance, of delivering good public services, of doing everything to drive economic growth, and a policy agenda that is about aspiration, prosperity, fairness, national resilience, all of these things, if you don't have that kind of policy agenda being effectively delivered, we ain't going to get a hearing on the national question. So much though I'm loath to use the phrase, there's a wee bit of back to basics needs to happen here. And I think that's the message that the electorate have delivered to us. So, the pause is here. We now need to decide how to best and most effectively use the time that the pause has given us. And I think there are smart, good, intelligent people on all wings of the party who can come together and foster that kind of debate and how we move forward. It will be uncomfortable. In fact, if it's not uncomfortable, we're not doing it properly. But I do think we can get there. But as it stands right now, Alex, to go back to your earlier question, we are on course to be on the opposition benches. And I would quite like to try and get ourselves into a position where we can stop that from happening.
Okay, let's pursue this a little further in terms of what needs to happen. When you look at the election result last week across the UK, there's an overwhelming sense, and I thought the problem for the Conservatives during the campaign is that there was nothing that they could have said or done because people had stopped listening to them after 14 years. When we get to 2026, you will have been in power for 19 years. Sometimes people stop listening. And where I will agree with your analysis is that I think that you're right, that if people see that you're a competent administration, if people see that their concerns are being directly addressed rather than concerns that they do not believe are central to their lives at this moment, the government and the country can be on at least the same page. But let me put to you that the problem is this, that the issue is one of the quality of public services, the sustainability of public services going forward, the difficult record that the SNP have in government, and it's difficult throughout all the nations of the United Kingdom. The problems are absolutely the same. And within the sort of fiscal framework in the next 2 years, given that whatever spending decisions Rachel Reeves is going to take as the new Chancellor, it is unlikely that there will be a transformational sum of money in Barnett consequentials that is going to give John Swinney and the government the scope to be able to really make a difference in the next 2 years. So it begs an obvious question. If you're going to reset and reconnect, how are you going to do it when, in practical financial terms, there is very, very little scope to improve matters?
Well, look, this is why we need the most fulsome debate possible. There are lots of smart and clever people, both inside the party and outside the party, who have an interest in us getting this right. I know the financial picture is difficult now, and it's difficult for the immediate future. But this isn't all about money. Money's a huge part of it, but it's also about a variety of other things. I've talked about the culture within the party and how that bleeds into the culture within the government. The general idea of getting back our mojo and getting back that reconnection that we've had with the voters, giving them a sense that we are listening to them. But they need to start seeing material differences. And we need to not be afraid to have the debate with ourselves and with the country, most importantly, about what those changes we need to see are. I think the challenges that we face, whether it's anemic growth, international challenges that bleed into the domestic agenda, climate change, population, all of these things, they're big, big questions. And we will not successfully answer them if we answer them within the kind of culture that we've had in the party for the past decade. So I want to see us grow up. I want to see us get serious. I want to see us have a debate where there are no sacred cows. Nothing is off the table. I want to do that in a way that's respectful, that doesn't see the party tear itself apart, that doesn't, act in bad faith and seek to shout people down, but is genuinely about an understanding that the SNP needs to redefine itself for the modern age. That's the big challenge we've got right now. We're too old school sounding. We're still using, even down to phrases like "bairns not bombs." That's a phrase that was invented 10 years ago. We're still punting it out on election literature. We talk about our public services being better than they are in England or in Wales. Well, that's all good and well, but are they better than they were in Scotland 5 years ago? Well, lots of people don't think that they are. So there's a big psychological and political and cultural reset needed within the party. Let's do it in a way that's smart, that's grown up. There are plenty of people both inside and outside who can contribute to that. And I hope that's what will now happen. I mean, we need to get into the debate in a nitty-gritty sense. We need to get into what that policy agenda looks and sounds like. At the minute, I'm kind of maybe talking more in high-level ideas, but let's get into that. But we can only do it properly if everything is on the table.
I mean, a couple of observations that flow from that, Stuart, because I think that's all very, very interesting indeed. So, I have never met a, quote, ordinary voter, unquote, and so on, who says, well, I'm a little bit disappointed with the way the health service is here in Scotland, but I tell you what, at least it's better than it is in Labour-run Wales. But one of the ththings I also thought was interesting from some of the TV debates amongst the Scottish leaders in this recent election campaign was when John Swinney, on a number of occasions, he was sort of saying, well, we'd like to do X, Y, or Z, but, all roads lead back to Westminster, a foolish phrase issued by Wes Streeting. And so, that we do the best we can within the limited powers that we have, the limited financial settlement that we have. Now, on one level, that is perfectly reasonable. It's a devolved administration. It doesn't have the full fat authority of an independent state. Certain things could be done differently in an independent Scotland, would have to be done differently in an independent Scotland. But what I thought was interesting was there was the audience reaction to this as the campaign went on. By the last debate, you had audibly people sort of tittering and jeering at what they saw was this sort of buck passing, blame shifting from John Swinney. We would love to do it, but we just can't. There's an obvious problem there, it seems to me. What happens if you come up against a political party that says, well, we can do it with the tools available? They've said they can't. Give us those tools. Let us do the job. So when you're talking again, it comes back to this question of seriousness and a culture of seriousness. It seems to me that there is something deeply immature and unserious about an SNP, a Scottish government party, that constantly says nothing is ever our fault, nothing is ever our responsibility. And the longer that goes on, after nearly 20 years in government, the harder it is to persuade people that actually it was all the problems are somebody else's fault.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's perfectly legitimate to point out the limitations of power. It's perfectly legitimate for a political debate, perhaps, to point out where you're performing better in one area than your opponents. What it is not is the foundation and the basis of a grown-up relationship with the country. And too often we've thought that it is, and that is sufficient. because I've watched Labour, right? And I have always said, and I still believe, there is nothing that says, no rule says Labour has to come back as the dominant force in Scottish politics. But I've watched them closely, and they're getting their act together. They're getting their act together in a way that's connecting with people. Now, look, the success that they enjoyed last week might well be numerically shallow. It might well be inflated by the voting system and whatever. Let's not seek comfort in that for too long. The reality is they're a party being taken seriously by voters once again, many of whom have voted SNP not just over the past decade, but over the past 17 years we have been in government. So we have got a problem. And the only way we can answer that problem is to be serious, is to be grown up, is to take hard decisions in the long-term interest of the country, not short-termism and tactical manoeuvres. And you know what the thing I find as well, and I've always thought this, but I think even more after the campaign we've just gone through, voters get this far, far better than political parties, my own especially, gives them credit for. They are up for those hard debates, hard discussions, and even where, too often the thought of debating a certain issue seems to offend many people within the SNP. Those days need to go behind us. We need to have a serious grown-up culture within the party, because at the minute we are just completely at odds with where the electorate is at. They know things are difficult. They know things are tough. They expect us to take tough decisions in their interests. And for as long as we rely on, it's not as bad as it is in Cardiff or whatever, we ain't going to move forward. We are only going to move backwards.
Picking up in this thread through all of your remarks, Stuart, is almost a sort of cultural point about how politicians and parties do politics, how they govern, how they arrive at decisions, whether or not they have mature debate, whether or not there is any space in the political firmament for people to float ideas. And let me put a point to you that I think that your analysis of cabals are bad, little closed leaderships are bad, um, looking on government as the management of party reputation rather than doing stuff which is in the national interest is absolutely correct. But let me also put to you a point that the entire failure of the devolved years, all 25 years of them, is that the culture which you have talked about today, as it relates to your own party, in my view, is a culture which has been there and a hallmark of every government in the devolved era. And one of the problems for social democratic politicians like yourself, who believe in social justice, who believe in empowering those who are at the margins of society, who want to make a demonstrable difference to the lives of those at the bottom of the heap. The question is simply this: does the current culture of politics allow you to take radical ideas to really transform lives, or does government become an exercise in the self-preservation of party? 25 years of devolution, we still have intergenerational poverty in Glasgow. 25 years of devolution, we still have a housing crisis. Collectively, Labour, Liberal Democrats and SNP politicians should all accept some of the responsibility for the current state of the way in which many of our citizens live their lives. And the problem is that the culture of all political parties, not just your own, is to be resistant to the ideas of change, which takes them out of their ideological comfort zone. And until all of the parties, the shape of the Scottish state has not changed in 25 years. We still have 32 local authorities. We still have too many territorial health boards. Taking tough decisions where you invest and reform means taking on vested interests. And the parties of government of the centre-left that have been in power in this country will never do that, because it means having hard conversations with the people that help them get into power in the first place. So your cultural point, I think, is spot on. I think it's extremely well made. I think the problem is that that's where all of the political parties are, Stuart.
Yeah, you're not wrong, Bernard, and I can already hear voices within my own party saying, "Oh, here he goes again, putting the boot in." But I do it from a place of affection, and I'm motivated by a desire for us to get this right. But look, a serious political culture would never have seen Liz Truss in Downing Street, right? And you're absolutely correct. There are too often when ideas are kind of floated or birthed. Too many people try and suffocate those ideas at birth. I give one example. During the COVID years, when we were in the lockdown years, and the government had asked people to sign up, to help, to volunteer, to help society in whatever way we could during that time. And I made the suggestion that this is something we could perhaps try and formalise. I was then accused of wanting to set up a children's army, or I was accused of wanting to bring back national service and all these wacky ideas, when all I was saying was,
you're ahead of your time
people
there.
clearly understand. Well, indeed, people clearly understand that national resilience is an important thing. Why don't we try and formalise this in some way with a new institution fit for the kind of threats and problems that we face, and do it in such a way that is rewarding for people and that they can get something out of it. At no point did I suggest national service or child soldiers, but that's what people, including elected members within my own party at the time, were accusing me of. You know, something that happens perfectly normally in Sweden and Denmark and Norway. I mean, it's absolutely mind numbing. That's the best way I can put it, Bernard. It numbs the mind. That when you want to have a conversation about new ideas, and look, maybe my idea was a terrible idea. That's fine. Doubtless I'll have more of them. But too often the reaction is just to suffocate things, shut them down, don't want to talk about that, too difficult, too risky, no interest. And that's not grown up, and that's not serious. It's not how most people organise their own lives. It's not how they organise their own workplaces, their own families, their own communities, relationships. And yet political parties seem to think this is a healthy way to operate. It numbs the mind.
It certainly does. I think a lot of voters feel that as well. That's perhaps an appropriate place to draw a conclusion to this episode of the show. Stewart, thank you so much for being with us, for being so frank, so candid, so interesting, so provocative, frankly, about the challenges facing the SNP. One final, just quick questions on. I mean, I know it's only a week or so since the electorate encouraged you to seek fresh pastures, shall we say? What does the future hold for you personally? And so, your political expertise and so on. A lot of that has been spent on defence and foreign policy, security questions, not just in terms of the United Kingdom, but Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe and beyond. Is that an area in which you would see yourself spending more time, or are you thinking about, well, maybe being unhorsed by the electorate in the House of Commons and so on, but I'd like to get back on the horse and seek election to the Scottish Parliament in 2026?
Well, I can tell you, Alex, 2026, as far as is on my mind, is not about me standing in that election. I'm not ruling it out, but I'm not actively thinking about it either.
So you're ruling it in,
the first
then?
thing I'm going to do is... Well, I'm not ruling it out, but it's not something I'm actively plotting. Let me just say that. But I think what I would quite like my biggest and toughest decision to be is, which beach am I going to, and how close can I get to the bar from the Sun Lounger? But more long term, I've got an interest in many of the policy areas you say. I'm off to Taiwan quite soon to an interesting conference. I'll have things to say on these related issues that I had hoped to say if I was continuing as a member of Parliament. What I won't be doing is hanging around like a bad smell. I'll only be talking if I think I've got something interesting to say, and putting pieces into the Scotsman on a Saturday. But yes, I think the first thing I need to do is get my new flat decorated and get a holiday.
Well, good luck with that. And as I say, thank you very much indeed for your time, your generosity of your time, and sharing your thoughts with us this morning. I think that's been a fascinating and illuminating analysis and discussion of some of the difficulties the SNP has experienced, some of the challenges it faces in the future. If you have a view on any of the subjects that we've touched on today, and we will presumably touch again on them in the weeks and months to come, do get in touch. We're ponsonbymassie@gmail.com. is our email address, Ponsonby Massie on X, formerly known as Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. If you're a business that would like to be in discussions with our audience, we'd love to hear from you about how we may facilitate that process of engagement. But for now, with many thanks once again to Stewart McDonald, the former SNP MP for Glasgow South, it's a very good morning from me.
And a very good bye from me.